Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where did it go?
Welcome, everybody, to another live stream edition of Liberty Lockdown. This is Clint Russell. I am back from Virginia. Had a great time on Timcast. Did both a Friday and Monday appearance. It was legendary. I enjoyed it tremendously. And to keep the legendary hits a-rolling, today I have on Professor St. Onge. He has been blowing up the Twitter sphere with his economic understanding. He comes from my camp. He's a fellow at Mises as well as an economist for Heritage. And without further ado, Doctor, what's up, brother?
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks.
You probably don't know much about me, but I was a mortgage broker for about a dozen years, had a mortgage shop, and come from the Austrian school. So I thought that this would be a tremendous conversation. I wanted to start off by getting into the urban doom loop video that you put out this morning.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, this is something that anyone with any Austrian economics understanding kind of saw coming. I don't think any of us understood that there would be a political alignment that actually seems to be propagating this, though, even as it degrades to the point of a breaking point in, San Francisco is the most obvious example, but there's many liberal cities that are doing the same, where they're embracing homelessness as well as, absolutely astronomical tax rates, very burdensome regulatory environment. The list goes on and on. They locked down many of these businesses for over a year. It doesn't seem as if the political class is willing to ever look in the mirror and realize that they are the cause of this destruction. Do you think they ever will?
They have become amazingly short-sighted, and in a sense, they've always been very short-sighted, right? It's been a very, very long time since we've actually had statesmen running the republic. But for, I think, most of our lives, voters had sort of held their feet to the fire to a certain degree. And it seems like something really changed over the past 5 or 10 years, where there's extraordinarily little accountability. The voters, I assume, are no better or worse than they've always been. And so, if you sort of look for what changed over that period, I think the best candidate is that the media. The media went from pretending to be objective to just covering for the regime. And we're to the point now where politicians do whatever is in their own interests in the very short term because they know that the media has their back.
Yeah. It is remarkable, though, that the voters in these cities aren't just having reality hit them in the face. I mean, I was born and raised in California, in San Diego, and I witnessed San Francisco and Los Angeles' degradation, but as soon as I saw it spread all the way to San Diego, I knew the whole state was lost, because San Diego was really the last bastion of any sort of sanity in California in terms of major cities. Obviously, there's still rural areas that aren't totally out of their minds. But let's get into the urban doom loop. You threw out a bunch of statistics that were really startling to me. I think from my vantage point as a former mortgage guy, most startling was the 30% plus vacancy rate in commercial real estate in San Francisco. That doesn't seem sustainable.
Yeah, it's incredible. That was some of the most in-demand real estate in the entire country. Before the pandemic, it was about a 4% vacancy rate, which from the industry that if 4% of the parking spaces are open in a city, you cannot find a parking space. I mean, it's not like, the 4% is just sitting there waiting for you to pick it up. That basically is going to feel to people like zero vacancy. And now it's 1 in 3. It's actually rising, right? What's happening at this point is that as the leases run out, stores, offices are just leaving. So, that's 31% with a bunch of the remaining ones locked in, implying that, over the next year or two, that might head towards 40, 50%. There is a point where the city is dead, right? You get this doom loop, this sort of accelerating collapse where the streets feel empty, the restaurants and stores close down. You've got nothing but, boarded up stores. And then even the people who are left, they feel like, the employees don't want to come to work. Uh, there is some point where they either decamp to the suburbs, which is what happened in Detroit, for example, or, they just move altogether, given that the state of California is pretty much putting the screws on them no matter where.
Well, it begs the question, do you think that the fate of San Francisco looks something like Detroit?
On the path they are going, I think it certainly looks like Detroit. The metropolitan area of Detroit actually didn't collapse as badly as people have in their mind. The city center of Detroit
Right.
emptied out and became a wasteland, but the suburbs of Detroit are pretty much like any suburb in the U.S. Because the state of Michigan did not go insane at the same time. So I think it's possible that what you could see in places like San Fran or LA could potentially be even worse than Detroit, where the city center is gutted while people in the suburbs are, they're looking at Austin or Dallas or really anywhere civilized that's outside of the state of California at the moment.
Well, what makes this unique, though, is that, Detroit kind of died because there was, at least this is my understanding of it, that there was a
Right.
globalization of the economy, and that much of the production of motor vehicles was being outsourced to Mexico and other countries with cheaper labor costs. And obviously the unionization and the labor costs in Detroit were higher than what they could find in other nations. This is a unique situation because there really isn't anything that's causing, in terms of just like natural economic competitive forces, that is causing the industries to flee San Francisco. It is strictly a governmental program, or am I wrong?
Yeah, I think you're right. Tech is doing just fine. They're running through a rough patch at the moment with layoffs, but a lot of that is just because they grew so fast during the pandemic,
Right.
Because they had a captive audience. But this is not a situation like Detroit where the main industry went into decline. Now, of course, even when we talk about Detroit, there were plenty of jobs created all over the country, right? So Austin, Seattle, even places like LA that are not particularly tech focused, plenty of other cities in the US got millions and millions of new jobs. So I think Detroit is not so much why did, the auto industry collapse. It's more like, well, sure, industries, cycle through all the time. From decade to decade, the jobs change. The question is really, why did those new jobs not come to Detroit? And I think what happened in Detroit is that the local government saw the car industry as a hostage that, it could just keep squeezing and squeezing more out of it. And yeah, that's true. They had factories set up. Those are very expensive factories. They had their workforce was there. The problem is that once you push them past a certain line, they go away. And once they go away, they do not come back. Yep. And meanwhile, they had created such a hostile attitude towards business in general because they had sort of this like hostage industrial complex that when that main hostage finally fled, all of those millions of new jobs that were created all over the country, those went to everywhere but Detroit.
Right. Well, and having been an entrepreneur in California, I can tell you that is a very similar tale to what I felt and experienced in that time. It was just like, okay, I'm getting taxed to death. The regulatory environment wants to, audit me every year because I'm not a conventional lender. So I'm being treated as if I'm a criminal, even though I'm not,
Right.
And then on top of that, you have the lockdowns. On top of that, you have, just generally unfriendly business practices, a regulatory environment that makes it absolutely miserable to exist, basically impossible to coexist with that state government. And I left and went 3,000 miles away, and I was probably one of about 1 million Californians that did that over the past 3 years or even more. And I don't think those people are coming back. So I'm just trying to get a vision for what California looks like. Are they just going to open up the border and replace it with, Mexican immigrants? I don't understand what they think their future is, or is it all just short-sighted because they're, cultists and true believers?
Yeah, that's what's happened in city after city. There's a political science term for it. It's called the Curly effect, which is where if you put in, policies against the rich or against companies, in theory, at some point, you're doing too much and they would push back. But what happens, in fact, is that they leave. And so the more extreme policies lead to a change in the electorate. Right. So that the more extreme you go, the more popular you actually get, because your remaining voters absolutely love what you're doing. Now, of course, the whole place absolutely collapses. But, that's happened in cities like St. Louis or Baltimore or Detroit, right? There's cities all over the country that, in theory, there should be some point where everybody looks around and says, wait a minute, this is crazy. Let's stop doing this. But no, those people leave. And then the remaining voters are, in fact, they want more. Maybe they want more handouts or more city benefits and so on.
Right. Well, I mean, but at some point, doesn't economics come into play where you have to be able to balance the budget, and if you have such an immense social safety net, you force out all of the productive class, and you have all of the people that are the takers that are flooding into these areas. It seems that bankruptcy is ultimately on offer.
Right. And if these city leaders actually looked at the entire city and, if their goal in life was to make the city a better place, then right, at some point they would sit there and sort of wake up and do the math, and they would say, wait a minute, this isn't working. We raised an additional 1 million in revenue, but we chase out 10 million worth of business, and they would stop doing it. But of course, the problem is that these leaders are not necessarily doing what's in the interest of their voters. They're doing what is in their own personal interest. Sure. Right. And they're, sure, give up 1 million or gain 1 million to lose 10 million, but did it help you win the next election? Did you get a nice soundbite out of it? Did you knock out the guy who is coming after you from the other side, who's even more progressive? So, for their own personal utility functions, it's basically in their interest to run the place into the ground.
Yeah, man. There's a big flaw in democracy, huh?
There is that. That's Hans Hermann Hoppe's thing, right? That monarchy treats the place like they own it, whereas democracies treat it like a rental car. They ride it hard. Yeah,
well, and democracy isn't a total disaster if you have a relatively honorable, hardworking, populace that votes in accordance with that. But we don't have that.
You could have that. The other solution, of course, is just to have a really strong constitution, right?
True.
A strong constitution it's basically a monarch, but he's dead, and he's already written down everything that he's going to do, so you don't have to worry about him going crazy.
Right.
So, of course, that's what sustained us for 150 years.
Yeah, but, then you also have to have a judiciary that's willing to enforce it properly, and if that becomes politicized in any way, then that's also a doomed path. So it's for sure. It's complicated, man. It's complicated. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the the Fed policy and the interest rate hiking cycle that we've experienced in a way that I've never experienced in my lifetime. I don't think you have either. Basically, the Fed funds rate went from a quarter point up to 5 over a little bit over a year period. 30-year mortgages are around 7% for 30 years, whereas they were around 3% just a year ago. And we really haven't seen the adjustment in pricing of housing that I would have expected, or at least we haven't yet. I think what's interesting, though, is that if you look at the rate on rent rates versus cost of ownership, if you have a mortgage, if you look in major metropolitan areas as well as some that aren't cities, that gap is very significant, where the cost of renting is much cheaper than it is the cost of ownership. And normally you have an equilibrium somewhere around where they're on par with one another. I assume that you'll agree with me that it's more probable that we won't see that gap close by rents increasing, but rather we will see that gap close by seeing prices decrease. Anything I've said that you disagree with?
Not that I disagree, but sort of the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, sort of point, right? So, if you look at places like Canada, for example, that the kind of housing bubble that Canada, Australia, I think the UK as well, they have seen housing bubbles that are massively bigger than even in the US. So for rich people internationally, the U.S. is really, really a bargain market, even at these prices. So in theory, the rent and the ownership should come together, but in practice, that can take a really, really long time. And what I think standing in the way at the moment is that people are not willing to sell. Right. So normally you have a certain amount of houses that come on the market because people's kids moved out or, whatever. They're downsizing, they're upsizing, they're selling their old place. But in this market right now, as you just mentioned, right, you might have bought the house with a 3% mortgage, but if you sell it and flip to another one now, you're going to have to pay a 7% mortgage. So there's this massive gap right now. And if people expected those 7% rates to last forever, then they might just say, well, that's life. I'm going to have to pay more. But of course, in this context, pretty much everybody expects that interest rates are going to come back to normal, which in their mind is something like 3-4% for mortgages. So they expect that to happen in the next year or two, which means that there's a whole lot of supply that is held off the market right now. True. People are basically speculating. Their kids moved out. They don't need a 4-bedroom house, but it would actually be more expensive to downsize. Meanwhile, of course, you have inflation that keeps marching, and inflation keeps pushing up house prices. So, you have sort of two really strong speculative reasons to keep your house off the market, even if you're ready to move.
Well, let me disabuse those people of the notion that 3 to 4% mortgages are the norm. That is a historic anomaly that we have never seen.
Right.
I mean, 6 to 8% was actually more within the ballpark of normal. And if there was any semblance of actual risk assessment that was happening when it came to lending out money, I think that would probably be closer to what a market would actually deliver upon. I can say that because I was a private money mortgage broker, and I would only lend money from 8 to 10% because that's really where the risk starts to make sense. Anything lower than that, and you're just looking at it like, well, this is stupid. Like I would never make this investment, but because we have all of these government entities that are either actually printing and lending out the money or guaranteeing it, Fannie, Freddie, et cetera. It really has distorted that market in a very deep way, and it has ultimately distorted the American psyche when it comes to homeownership. They don't understand it. They think that it's a parabolic rise in housing, but really it's just, in my estimation, a hedge against inflation at best, right, and ultimately a depreciating asset. It's bizarre though, because I've just gone through the process of building 6 houses in San Diego, and thank God I'll be out of there in about a month or 2 months maybe. But it took me 5 years, and the planning, obviously the lockdowns and the planning departments that just went on hiatus for a year was backbreaking. But basically what I'm saying is the inventory quotient in the supply demand ratio is like that I just don't know if there's enough building going on to actually offset the people that are in their homes and refuse to list them for sale, even though they probably want to. Have you looked into the new build statistics and things like that? Do you have any idea if I'm wrong and that there is going to be a huge flood of inventory?
The best data, so I don't know the overall numbers. I do know that anecdotally there have been a number of reports saying that even large developers cannot get financing for projects, right? So that could be downstream where banks themselves are having trouble. The vast majority, I think about 70% of real estate loans are regional banks, which are currently in trouble thanks to the Fed screwing around. Right. And so, it might make sense financially for them to lend, but as an organization right now, they are risk averse. And so they're actually holding off loans out of fear that, that could sort of push them into being over leveraged.
Right. Because they're concerned about liquidity because they're sitting on a bloodbath book of T-bills and things like that that are underwater because of Fed policy. It's really like if you were, with our understanding of economics, if you were to try and destroy the economy, you would you be doing anything different?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. and this is a frequent topic on Twitter, right? As people ask, are they doing this on purpose? And because it certainly looks like it's on purpose.
It does, man. You just. It's like it's all so predictable though if you just come from the Austrian school, but it's like the people that actually rule over us come from the Keynesian school or just straight Marxism, and
Yeah.
it's just disturbing. It's disturbing that we have. Let's instead of going down the black pill path, I'm curious to get your take on Bitcoin. Are you a believer?
Yeah, I'm definitely a believer. I think that it is effectively gold, but unseizable. Gold's biggest flaw, I mean, of course, gold's biggest attraction is that it's physical. That's like the whole point, right? But of
Right.
course, that's also its biggest flaw, because you have to put it somewhere, and you have to put a big wall around it with sharks with laser beams on their head, because otherwise
Right.
people will steal your gold. And the problem is that once you do that, it's very, very easy for governments to figure out where your gold is, and they can come visit you, and they can have pleasant conversations about what you'll be doing with that gold. And because one of the tricks on being a gold bug is that fiat bros might ask, well, if gold is so amazing, then how come no country today uses gold? And I think the answer is because governments are very, very good at violence. In fact, that's the only thing. They're not particularly good at it, but they're very interested in doing it.
They have a monopoly on it, though.
They do. And so that means that gold sort of always lives at the pleasure of the state. It is always vulnerable. And so for me, that's really the magic, problem that Bitcoin solves. Now, in terms of is the dollar going to collapse or we're going to go to Bitcoin, I think there it probably depends on the timing, right?
Yeah.
So if fiat has like 3 years left to go, which I don't think is likely, but anyway, let's just, for argument's sake, if fiat's only got 3 years left, then probably the next thing is going to be gold, because not that many people understand Bitcoin. They're not real comfortable with it. On the other hand, if fiat's got another 20 years to go, then I suspect that we'll just skip the whole gold stage altogether. I think either way, we're going to be at a Bitcoin standard sooner or later, whether we're talking 40 years, however long it's going to take. But whether or not we go through this gold stage in between, I think depends on the timing.
That's a really good analysis, and I tend to agree with you. I think that, you've seen particularly the BRICS nations that have been stocking up on gold. You haven't seen a central bank, aside from El Salvador, that has really even dipped a toe into the Bitcoin market, and I find that to be really interesting, because there is a huge first mover advantage for any central bank to do so. Essentially,
Right.
they have the printing press. They can acquire something with limited supply with something that they have an unlimited supply of. It just seems as if in terms of risk benefit analysis, if I was in charge of a central bank, I would be absolutely doing that. I would be,
Right.
Acquiring 1 million Bitcoin or something if I was the, head of the Treasury for the U.S., but they're not. And
Right.
I assume it's because they don't want to see, their racket fall. And if they were to do so, the cost of Bitcoin would go parabolic, and it would ultimately expedite their demise. Do you think that's the reason they haven't?
I think most central banks in the world are neither buying Bitcoin nor gold.
True.
And the analysis is similar for both, where you have a huge first mover advantage. And I think part of that is just lack of creativity. Again, central banks, I think, truly do not understand Bitcoin.
God, that's
they don't
crazy.
only attack it, because they're venal. I think they also attack it because they're stupid. But even so, we can sort of control for the stupidity, and we can look at gold, which should be subject to sort of the same dynamics, where you've got this big first mover advantage.
Mhm.
And I think that there does come a point where central banks start concluding that the whole jig is up, and so at that point they'll again, they'll probably go to gold first, just for lack of creativity. But until we sort of get to that end stage, most of them are still looking at very conventional assets, generally foreign exchange. Some of them dip into ETFs and buying up stocks. The Japanese central bank, for example, has been doing a lot of that. I think that the most likely scenario where fiat actually gets backing is the BRICS scenario, right? Where
Exactly.
China is pushing this alternative currency to the US dollar. It's a slow slog for them, right? They're sort of bribing countries into it with cheap development loans, and sort of hand to hand, step by step. That's all going to take a long time. And the game changer there what would really advance a BRICS currency to something that could literally dethrone the US dollar, I think, would be backing it probably with gold. At that point, I mean, initially nobody would believe it. They would say, okay, yeah, gold-backed currency from China and, famous monetary expert Brazil, right? So initially people would laugh, but you don't actually need that much gold to actually back a currency. It's a surprisingly small amount. China already probably has enough. And if they were to back some kind of BRICS currency, and people were to come in and trade the paper for the gold, and after a couple months of seeing that it actually works, people would start believing it empirically.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to go a different direction, in what would dethrone the dollar would be that instead of the BRICS nation and the yuan or whatever basket of currencies that they make their reserve currency competitor out of, I was thinking that it would probably be that the U.S. Essentially, because they're let me see how I can phrase this, because there's been so much demand for treasuries in America, and it seems that because the BRICS are actually starting to compete. Basically, the overarching analysis here is that I'm really concerned that the Ukraine crisis with Russia and the risk of World War III is about defending the petrodollar system, and I think that the biggest threat to the U.S. dollar would be Saudi Arabia and basically all of the oil producing nations starting to sell in something other than U.S. dollars. Is that an overstated concern amongst our camp?
I think it is. Overall, of course, the U.S. wants everybody to use the U.S. dollar, so they continue giving us useful things for green bits of paper. I think they have that preference, but especially in this administration, they have been so stupid about keeping that reserve status. There are sort of two big data points. So one of them is actually in the Ukraine conflict, where when it started, the U.S. did sort of its standard menu of sanctions against Russia, but it did something new, which is that it seized the sovereign dollars of the Russian central bank.
Right.
Okay, so it took about $300 billion that belonged to the Russian central bank by all accounts. In terms of the U.S. economy, that would be more like $4 trillion. Okay, that was a very substantial chunk of change. And they did that because they wanted to set off bank runs in Russia. And of course, that backfired. We got bank runs instead.
Yeah.
But that crossed a really big line for countries all over the world, where it had sort of been understood, right? Even during the Cold War, we had multiple proxy wars going on all over the world, and we never, ever even talked about doing something like that. And the reason is because if you want to be the reserve currency, you have to take all comers. You even want your enemies to depend on you, right? And once they politicized that, it was unbelievably stupid. The cost benefit, right? So whatever pain you're going to inflict on Russia in this particular conflict versus essentially dooming the US dollar on a slow fuse, because now we're seeing countries all over the world. It's not just the BRICS gang. It's ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries. They had a conference a couple months ago. The Indonesian president literally said, look what happened to Russia. We have to diversify out of the US dollar. So that is so unbelievably stupid. Another one that they're just starting with this front now is, at least seizing Russian central bank assets. Most countries don't invade their neighbors. And so maybe you would imagine most countries say, well, sure, but as long as I don't invade Ukraine, then I should be okay. And what the administration is doing now is they're putting pressure on countries over their domestic policy. So just the other day, they started putting pressure on Uganda. Uganda, like most African countries, is extremely conservative on social issues. Obviously, right. This is true for about 185 out of the 200 countries in the world. They're all worth a sanction if Ukraine is over, the number of official genders. And so this is sort of opening up a new front here where, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries all across Africa, places like India, Latin America, really pretty much everything, again, has to question, are we going to catch sanctions? Are they going to go after our dollars because they don't like some random domestic policy? And, of course, if you're a country like Uganda, you kind of can't bow to that pressure. I mean, that it's a very heartfelt issue in Uganda. Right. The U.S. is even putting pressure right now on Japan. Japan has a big LGBT policy debate. And traditionally, it had sort of been understood that the U.S. and Japan stay out of each other's domestic affairs because we have a military relationship, and you want to keep that nice and clean. And the administration has been making waves over there because the ambassador has just, been sticking his finger in everything to do with this debate here. And the sort of background intimation is that the military relationship may degrade if Japan doesn't do exactly what the U.S. wants. These countries are not going to accept that kind of serfdom. They are going to start diversifying out of the U.S. relationship, which, partly that means, looking for other alternatives, whether it's doing it themselves or becoming more friendly to China. And then the other, of course, is directly it means getting out of the dollar. If countries worldwide start getting out of the dollar, then you start this process where the dollar starts getting weaker and weaker. Okay, that means that even foreign holders that don't have any beef with the U.S., they start exiting the dollar simply because it's getting weaker, because the trend is not there for them. Right. Korean banks, for example, hold hundreds of billions of U.S. dollars in the form of treasuries, and they just hold them on their balance sheets. They don't have an opinion about the U.S., good nor bad. But if all of these countries now are exiting the U.S. dollar and then the value starts going down, then you could get this giant rush. And, sort of when you zoom out, the unique problem that Americans have is that there are something like 2 or 3 times more dollars in existence than Americans need, right? Because that extra 1 to 2x is parked overseas. And right. Up until now, it's been happily parked overseas. If all of that money comes rushing back, then the risk is you get that accelerating feedback loop where, now everybody is flushing the dollar. And then the dollar could actually be uniquely weak. Essentially, all of the strength that the U.S. dollar built up 80 years out of being the reserve currency, now it all comes back for payback.
It's basically an inverse of milkshake theory. It's the bang moment where the U.S. dollar becomes the weakest of the bunch as opposed to the strongest. That's a really great analysis. And I think that, what you're seeing or what you were describing when it comes to these other nations that have really met their limit, where they're like, we cannot have you dictating our domestic policy when it comes to trans rights. Right. This is fucking lunacy. What are you talking about? What I've really, had my eyes open to over the past 3 years since I started doing my show was the financial warfare that has been wrought upon the American people, but more broadly the global population via the IMF and World Bank, the World Economic Forum, kind of the economic hitman stuff. But then you now have the implementation of ESG, which propagates CEI and DEI, which has, corporate America, really the many other nations also in the world that their corporate environment has been forced down this path of accepting some sort of, radical sexual progressivism. And it's really running afoul of not just the governments of some of the more conservative leaning nations, but it's also getting to the point that it's so overbearing that even the conservatives, the sleeping giant in America, seem to have finally, met their limit. And you're now seeing significant protests against, Bud Light, Target, a whole bunch of companies that have been in the news as of late. Do you think that we've met a tipping point where, the ESG cabal is actually under threat, or is it overstated and we still have a ways to go?
I think the coalition is building. I think, unfortunately, it does have a ways to go. The corporate media, really the institutions across American society anyway, have been captured by the left. They, proselytize this stuff or propagandize it. We saw the whole machine in all its glory during COVID. Pushing the various policies that they used to fight COVID. And I think that it really takes a long time to fight that. If you've got family members, for example, who still believe sort of the mainstream narrative, it feels like you're talking to an insane person. You're like, do you see this video? And they'll be like, wow, that's probably a fake video. And at what point I think it takes a long time to break the habits of a lifetime of believing the regime narrative. And, what I think is driving it fundamentally is in the wake of the 2008 crisis. right? Where left and right looked like they were going to get together for a minute there, right? We had Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party, and we were saying the same thing. And I think that that was really terrifying to the establishment. And so that, I think, was really the genesis of this, when corporate decided that they had to make peace with one side or the other. And, the left activists were sort of better implanted in the institutions because they've infiltrated the government. And so they went on this campaign to really divide the two sides. So in a sense, this super aggressive corporate social policy, I think, was their defense mechanism to disarm the people, to keep the people in the U.S. split. But of course, the problem is that that particular question is not topical in some places like, say, Japan. The main goal of corporate Japan is not to keep the Japanese people split so that they can keep crushing them. Right. And so for them, this is kind of like, this isn't something they want, right? They would rather not comment on transgender policy or, whatever the issue is. They would rather do what companies have always done, which is stay out of the limelight and just keep doing business. So I think there's this constant tension where, individual companies, whether it's Bud Light or Target or whatever, really, it's in their own interest to just stay out of this crap. Just keep doing what you've always been doing and stay above the fray. I think what's pushing it probably started with finance, really, because, they are such an unpopular industry at all times that, they keep fanning this stuff. And it's an interesting question what the transmission mechanism, how other Fortune 500s got on board. But at the end of the day, I think that they have a very fragile coalition where, it is always in shareholders' interest to not stir up trouble. To, if you take the social media companies, for example, it is obviously in the interest of, let's say, Facebook to not censor half their population, right? In the ideal world, everybody in the world, every single human spends all day on Facebook talking about crap so they can look at advertisement, right? This should be Facebook's goal in life. And instead, what are they mucking around with environment and COVID treatments and so on, right? Like, stick to your knitting. So I think that what's sort of optimistic here is that the business logic is that businesses should always want to shut up and just make the customer happy. I think a lot of us had sort of relied on that. Like, at least speaking for myself, I'd sort of trusted big business to do the right thing because it's in their interest. Right. And this is sort of a core belief in economics anyway, is that people will do what's in their interest. And I think what's been amazing is the degree to which a lot of these companies have really been shooting themselves in the foot, presumably because they're responding to this activist pressure where, I think the activist pressure is actually upstream of them, but then they feel this, there's a whole set of institutions that will punish you. For example, if you cross the line on something like transgender, they're sort of captured in a sense where they would prefer to not talk about it, but they sort of have to.
Well, see, I think the incentive structure is even more deranged than that because of the finance environment that implemented ESG.
Sure.
I mean, because it's just not enough pressure from the activist groups to get them to do this. Like, it's just there's not a big enough percentage of the country that alienating the conservative half of the U.S. ultimately to the benefit of 1 to 10%, maybe, if you want to be really gracious, say 20% of the population that is all on board with the sexual progressivism agenda. It just doesn't pencil, but it does pencil when you take into consideration BlackRock and its $9 trillion it's going to acquire shares of your company only if you propagate this narrative. Well, what's bizarre to me is that there hasn't been lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty against BlackRock, against State Street, Vanguard, the guys who are wielding these pension plans and things like that are dictating that these businesses do things that damage the bottom line. That to me is really the silver bullet in terms of like breaking this unholy alliance. Do you think that there's any hope of that in the future?
Yeah, I agree. I've been surprised that there have not been more shareholder lawsuits. Normally, if the CEO of a company is siphoning money off and lending it to his cousin, then that's not in his fiduciary interest. He may personally believe that his cousin is a very good businessman, but he's not allowed to do that. Right. So similarly, if you're Bud Light and you're alienating 80% of your customer base to appeal to exactly who, then that sort of should be looked at the same way as very irresponsible. I think that the U.S. legal system has traditionally left that, sort of had a hands-off approach, which probably traditionally is the right answer. But the problem is that the mechanisms for that sort of traditional feedback mechanism are that you get shareholders who organize, and then they bring up votes at the shareholder meeting.
Right.
And as you say, what's happened is BlackRock and some of these other outfits, they have, it's really an oligopoly. I think it's like 2 or 3 outfits that basically control completely. They're called proxy. I think it's proxy advisors. Yep. They essentially control corporate America between whatever 2 or 3 companies. And so, even if there's like a grassroots movement to come up with some kind of shareholder vote to get these guys to correct, there are countries where that would probably work, like Japan, say. Right. But in the U.S., it is so oligarchic at this point that you're really cut off from that.
Yeah, it seems criminal. I mean, it really does.
Yep.
And I'm a libertarian. I don't really want government involvement in this type of stuff. But the reality is that their oligopoly has been created because of their relationship with the central banks as well as the governments. Mm-hmm. So it's like, but now I have to turn towards the government to try and alleviate this government-created issue, and that doesn't help me ultimately get closer to my worldview, most likely either. It's a very difficult calculation to make as ultimately an anarcho-capitalist. I don't have a real answer here.
No, it is. And the story of the genie with the 3 wishes, and the way that that's normally played out is that the wishes are all twisted so that you regret every single one, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
that is government. There are a lot of people, even on the right side, who want to push for government solutions, whether it's social media speech or issues like corporate governance. And you always, it may be a good idea sometimes, but you always want to assume that this is a genie who is not acting in here. The deep state, the government is almost universally left-wing. The judges, the lawyers, across the board, everybody who's going to be interpreting this thing is going to be a left-winger. It is going to be turned on you.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And usually competition is how you solve these issues. But if you have a regulatory environment that's so captured, and you also have ESG, and you have basically the reins of lending, which are being strangled unless you acquiesce to the diversity, equity, inclusion cabal, how do you compete? I mean, you would have to generate the seed capital either through consumer demand or some other wealthy anarcho-capitalist leaning type of billionaire or something like that.
Right. Which there is an optimistic side to that, though, right? Which is that there are enormous opportunities for that sort of circular economy where you've got, let's call it ANCAP. Anyway, where you've got ANCAP people selling to ANCAPers, producing ANCAP products, and so on down the line. Because consider, so if you take Twitter, for example, Twitter had this massive exodus of advertisers. Presumably they were getting pressure from activists, and so they were afraid to advertise. What that means is that Twitter ads are cheap. And so if you are a small business and you would like to compete with, say, Target, cheap advertising, like if you're a restaurant and you're getting cheap food, that's definitely a benefit. Okay. Mm-hmm. You can outcompete the other guys. If you're getting cheap advertising, that is 100 times more powerful than a restaurant getting cheap food because you can scale it.
Right.
Okay. So if you've got a tiny little business and you're getting almost free advertising, you can grow that thing 100-fold. It is rocket fuel. I used to teach marketing at a business school. Cheap advertising is astounding. Okay. It's like nitro, in the tank. So there are benefits with that. Another huge benefit, of course, is that you've got this massive audience who feels disserved. Right? If you want to do a subscription razor company, normally you've got to go up against Gillette. Gillette knows what it's doing. They have massive brand. They have all these resources. They can call up retailers and get you pulled. It's astounding, right? But in this case, well, the audience is clamoring for your product. You could, put up a website, advertise on Twitter. You don't have to go through Walgreens and the rest of it. And you could make a lot more sales than you could if Gillette were actually in the game competing against you. So in a sense, it's a good thing. It's like corporate America largely has disarmed itself, at least for, I think, easily 50% of the population rejects this stuff. I think it's growing every year. You've got all these people talking about walking away from the Democrats. They are extremists. They're fundamentalists. If you violate any one point, you look at J.K. Rowling's, the Harry Potter author, lifelong liberal. She was on, or progressive. She was on board with every single issue. I mean, she had her card stamped every day for X years. And then one single issue she wasn't on board with, and that was it. She was off the bus. And, a lot of people now who are kind of celebrities on the right, people like Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk, they did not start out as libertarians. Generally, I mean, Jordan Peterson was a psychology professor at a prestigious university. That is almost shorthand for an extreme liberal. Right. But once you wake up on one issue, this is sort of the red pill or the black pill. It's like a thread in a sweater. You pull one and the whole thing comes down. So I think, going back to that circular economy, if we're looking at a world where advertising specifically is extremely cheap, and where companies are unwilling to compete with you for 50, 60, 70% of the market, I mean, this is the golden age, and the whole golden age is to make some money as a non-woke business person.
I think that's a great silver lining on all this. And, I'll just speak to my own case, is that I reach somewhere around in the arena of 20,000 people per episode, and I've only been doing the show for 3 years. It's like that is something that you really couldn't have done without some sort of corporate overlord that was harnessing and ultimately curtailing what I really wanted to say. And I say whatever the hell I want to say, and if I feel like it runs afoul of YouTube, I put it over on Rumble. And if it and if I get suspended from both, then I'll have Odyssey and I'll have the audio catchers. And it's like essentially the entrepreneur in this environment, even though it is challenging, you can always find kind of a chink in the armor, and you can get through. And I think that you're totally right that there is a huge burgeoning economy of people of demand, consumers that want this type of information. And that gives me a lot of hope that, Joe Rogan is the biggest media enterprise in human history. Some of his episodes have been listened to by 40, 50 million people. It's absolutely crazy. So I think that the future is bright. It's just a lot of heartache and headache in the interim.
Yes.
But you've recently started your show, and it seems to be taking off. Go ahead and tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, yeah, I was shocked. I kept talking about how it would be fun to do videos. I used to do these when I was teaching the students, and they're MBA students, so they would show up hungover. And so I would do these little talks at the beginning of class, just kind of going through the news and, try to make it a little bit interesting for them and mildly funny. The goal was to give them some little thing that they could tell their friends about at night, so that, just kind of keep it interesting. And anyway, I was doing that for a while, and I enjoyed doing it. And so I told my wife, I think I should get back to doing that. She said, well, just put a video. And I was like, no, I got to practice, and I got to get rid of the ums, and, I got to do better on camera. And then one morning she asked me, this was with the bank collapse when Silicon Valley Bank went down. And she said, what's happening with the banks? And I gave her a shtick for and she said, so she got out the camera and she was like, okay, say it again. She put it up. It, by sheer coincidence, happened to be 3.5 minutes, which, of course, everybody knows that's way too short for a piece of content. You can't do 3.5 minutes. You got to have a narrative, and you got to have research. It's got to be 20 minutes because people are driving to work, whatever. But anyway, just by sheer accident, it was 3.5 minutes because that's what I told her on the banks. And then it took off. It was like 200,000 views or something.
Crazy.
And I said, okay, the market has spoken. So let me stop thinking about what the product should look like and just continue with this.
Yeah.
So yeah, doing that every day now for, I think, 3 months.
That's awesome, man. You're the TikTok economist.
Apparently, for better or for worse.
Well, I mean, if that's the attention span that people have, you got to meet people where they're at.
Apparently, yes, you do. It's actually, I discovered I like it because the thing is, with 3.5 minutes, you can go hardcore, right? You can give lots of data, you can give lots of analysis. You don't have to put any helper words in there. You just run through that sucker. Because honestly, like if you tried to do that for 7 or 10 minutes, the audience is going to get exhausted.
Yeah.
So 3.5 works. You can like do it really super high level. You can bring in all kinds of terms. You can use metaphors that make central banking. Like one of my top videos was on money draining out of banks into money market funds. Okay, that is not normally a viral topic. Okay, like I would not have guessed of all the topics, money going to money market funds. But, I think the reason is because they're so short, people don't get exhausted.
Well, it's that, and it's also just topics that people don't hear about. So it's novel. Right. It's novel to the vast majority of people to come across that in a shorter format that they can actually be like, I've never heard this. Let's see what he has to say. I remember on Rumble, my Silicon Valley Bank breakdown, which I also did. I did a 10-minute breakdown on it, and I'm a little bit more long-winded than you, but I think it did like 10,000 views over on Rumble, and I was blown away by that because, I had just
on Rumble, that's a lot.
Yeah. And I had just started my Rumble account, so I had no subscribers. So it just was like, wow. It was being shared. People were actually finding it compelling and sharing it because I think that. Particularly for the Austrian economics backdrop, like we have an analysis that people just don't hear elsewhere, and ultimately, I believe we're correct. So that makes it extra compelling. But yeah, I'm just thrilled to see your success and the fact that you've thrown your hat in the ring. It makes me sad to think that a college professor of your caliber is now relegated to the podcast world with us peons. But are you still teaching at all?
No, that was in Taiwan. So I never taught in the U.S. The only schools that would take an Austrian they didn't want me for religious reasons because I'm atheist. So
what?
It's common. I am not even judging, but at any rate, typically they would want like a pastor statement, and so I am not going to abuse that system. But at any rate, so. And my wife was interested in moving back to Asia anyway. She's Japanese American. Mm-hmm. And so we looked at schools in Asia. You have complete political free speech in Asia. There are a ton of right-wing professors who are refugees in like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, absolutely full of them. I think all of the foreign professors at my business school were right-wingers. I think all of them were actually Christians as well, because that's another group that gets chased out of American academia.
Good Lord.
So So, I mean, I love being over there. The problem, Taiwan it's just an incredible country. The problem is that you're sort of out of the mainstream. And, sure. As I saw the U.S. Fall apart, I kind of felt like when I'm 70, I guess I can go goof around in Taiwan and let everybody else take care of it. But I kind of felt like I was not doing my duty. I was not on the wall.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you are back with us because I think that really does portend bad things from a nationalistic perspective when it comes to economic competition. Like if you have academic institutions that push out atheists or Austrian thinkers or Christians for that matter, how can you possibly expect to compete with other academic institutions which are bringing up thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions even or billions in the case of China, of students that are given a more well-rounded, economic understanding, business education, things like that. It just seems, if you're concerned about, U.S. hegemonic economic domination of the globe, that would be the first thing you would do. But instead, we're going the opposite direction. Do you think that trend is there any chance of that shifting? Because it doesn't seem like it to me.
Yeah, no, I don't think at all. I think the best we can hope for is just that, if we take business students, for example, in other words, the people who will be running large American companies, my only hope is that they can get news or they can get wisdom and guidance and learning from, channels like ours, basically find it on YouTube or Twitter or whatever, because I think American academia is just, it is irredeemable.
Yeah.
The only way I think that it's going to get fixed is that it has to collapse, and it's not going to collapse until it gets cut off from the government money.
Well, or the government money stops being able to purchase anything.
That is another way to do it. Yes, that is correct. If you get to the point where the government has to keep all its money to pay the soldiers, then yes, a number of institutions would change.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap with that. Let's figure out, what's your assessment of there's so many different angles I could take this. World War III with Russia and Ukraine and the proxy war. Do you think that we avoid that? And ultimately, do you have any estimation as to our economic situation over the next 2 to 10 years? For me, I don't have much doubt on the ultimate end phase, but I have a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to timeline. And you probably feel similarly, but maybe you have better clarity than I do.
Yeah, I think on Ukraine that, first off, I think the U.S. alone is making the decisions there. I mean, of course, Russia could always just surrender, but knowing what everybody's kind of red lines are and what's realistic in the world, I think that war ends when the U.S. decides it ends. And I think that what's most in the U.S. interest is keeping it going on a low smolder as long as possible. Very, very good for the budget. It exhausts Russia, which I'm not exactly sure why we care who gets exhausted, but at any rate, apparently that's a policy goal. Both Ukraine and Russia strike me as not democracies. We'll just leave it there. So I'm not sure why we actually have a horse in that fight. I don't think that the U.S. wants to escalate it from there. But I'm not super certain of that. I assume that the people in the military still are professional enough that they're not going to let it go too far. But honestly, I would have thought that during COVID that we had professionals in the CDC and in these other organizations who would have stepped in when it got real crazy, like when they were arresting doctors for prescribing things. I would have thought that these sort of deep state protectors would have stepped in and stopped the insanity, but they did not. So it is possible that they will not in Ukraine either. In terms of the economy in the next 5 or 10 years, I think you and I probably agree that we know how the book ends, but we don't know how each chapter ends.
Right.
And a lot of it is going to have to do with just how much the government screws up. I think if you sort of zoom out, it's important to remember that the people in any country, the people are always making everything better. Okay, they are making the economy do better. They are creating jobs. They are reducing inflation by creating more stuff. Like every single number in a society is always trying to go up. It is trying to get better simply because the people are trying to make it better. That's the whole notion of free markets. That's why we like free markets in the first place. So, in order, like, Biden could be incredibly stupid and he could keep doing stupid things and we could still bounce back. And the reason is simply that he is not stupid enough to counteract
to offset us.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think if I had to bet on it, like if I were actually putting money on it, then I don't think fiat's going to collapse, or the US dollar is going to completely collapse in the next couple of years. I think that the next 10 years will most likely look like the past 10 years. So it'll be relatively slow growth. Elections along the way are going to change a lot. Trump in many ways changed the trajectory on the economy. Of course, COVID came in, or the COVID lockdown screwed that up. But you can get a lot from that. Maybe a cleaner example is Reagan, right? So the 1970s, I think, is closest to where we are right now, where cities were falling apart, the economy sucked, unemployment was high, the wages were not growing, you had double-digit inflation, and then you got Reagan, and I mean, it was astounding. It was like somebody had turned on the light, and just the entire country flipped. So yeah. I think it is possible.
Do we have a Paul Volcker, though?
No, I don't think we do, because I think the establishment saw what happened with the last Paul Volcker, which is that, and for those who don't know, Paul Volcker crashed the economy. He's largely responsible for the Morning in America of Reagan. But the problem with Paul Volcker is that Jimmy Carter lost that election, right? In other words, all of Washington saw what happened, which is that Volcker forced Jimmy Carter to take one for the team, and they're not interested in doing that again. And so I think that as successful as Volcker was for the American people, from the uniparty DC perspective, he was an enormous failure. They would have been much better off just keep grinding it down.
Yeah. Well, makes me wonder. I shouldn't wonder. I shouldn't give Trump any sort of benefit of the doubt. But with him not having another election if he were to win in 24, he would have the capacity to do what's right. But unfortunately, I already know his track record, and it was to browbeat Jerome Powell or whoever it was into reducing interest rates and ultimately loosening monetary policy when he should have been tightening. And I just don't think that he's got the worldview that's necessary to make that happen. So I think that we're probably on a slow path to a ultimate hyperinflationary blowout, just because we don't have the political will or anyone with a low enough time preference to actually do the right thing. But we'll see.
And again, to sort of end on a bright note,
yes,
at that
please.
point, we do get to a hard money system once again. We will eventually get there. Of course, there's the easy way and the hard way, right? The easy way is to convince enough people that voters, elect more Ron Pauls, and we can actually have an adult conversation. And then there's the hard way, which is that we get there anyway. So like many policies, like the free market in general, you are always going to get to the free market. It's just, how much human suffering comes between now and then. So
how many times do we get kicked in the mouth? How many times do we get kicked in the mouth in the interim?
The funny thing, to me anyway, is that if you look at the history of every communist revolution in the 20th century, every single one of them went right wing. They went socially conservative. Every single one, almost overnight. Fidel Castro was, the other guy, the guy with the motorcycle, Che was personally murdering homosexuals in Cuba. He was joyously. He requested to do that. Most leaders don't ask to do that because it's not considered a fun job. China, Soviet Union, all of these countries literally outlawed homosexuality. Yeah. China, at the moment, they put out guidance saying no girly men on TV, right? Which, of course, includes no homosexuals on TV. So the sort of irony here, this is what I keep trying to tell left-wingers. I'm like, guys, you don't understand what you're doing. If you keep pushing like this, you are going to get the exact opposite of what you want. Now, you're also going to have a lot of misery and starving children and all these other things that come along with communism. So I'm not rooting for it. But the moral of the story here is that, when you see this incredibly powerful sort of deep state activist, academia, the public schools, you've got just this overwhelming odds on the other side. But you always remember that they always lose because their system does not work. Everything always goes back to tradition, free markets, hard money.
There you have it, folks. We're going to be all right. Straight from the mouth of Professor Peter St. Onge. I've already linked to his info down below. If you guys want to support my work, go to libertylockdown.locals.com. And if you'd like to come see me speak, I will be at Icarus Fest. Go to icarusfest.com. Use code LOCKDOWN20 for 20% off. It is this Saturday in New Jersey. Come check it out. It's one of the best lineups of anti-war speakers I've ever seen, and I think it'll be a blast. Thank you again for joining us.
Of course. It was a pleasure. It was fun, Clint.
We'll catch you guys soon. We're out.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold. Where did it come from and where?